Good afternoon. Welcome to the third day of National Webinar Series on Higher Education as envisaged in New Education Policy 2020, organized by Ravinshaw University. We are fortunate to have three eminent resource persons with us today. Our first speaker is Professor Soumendra Mohan Patnaik. Professor Patnaik, an alma mater of University of Delhi, is a professor of anthropology and vice chancellor, Utkal University, Bhubaneswar. In his career span of more than 2 decades, he has held many important positions like President of Indian Anthropological Association. He was Fulbright Nehru Visiting Fellow at Virginia Tech University, US, and has published more than 30 research papers along with books of international repute like Culture, Identity and Development, Displacement, Rehabilitation and Social Change, the case of Paraja Highlanders, and Indian Tribes and the Mainstream to his credit. Our second speaker is Professor Santosh Kumar Panda. Professor Panda is a professor of distance education since 1997 and former chairperson, National Council for Teacher Education, Government of India, regulating about 19,000 teacher education institutions in the country. An educationist par excellence with a Fulbright postdoctorate in online professional development from University of New Mexico, US, Professor Panda has been Director, Staff Training and Research Institute of Distance Education, IGNOU, Delhi, Director, the Association of India University, Delhi, Director, Center for Flexible and Distance Learning, the University of South Pacific, Fiji, Founding Director, Inter-University Consortium for ICT, IGNOU, Delhi, Visiting Professor at
बच्चन
foreign universities
बच्चन
like University of London, UK, and University of Maryland, USA, and founder editor of the journal Staff and Educational Development International, and former chief editor of Indian Journal of Open Learning. He is also member National Board of Yoga Certification Technical Committee, Ministry of Ayush, Government of India, and has provided consultancy for various international organizations like Asian Development Bank, Foundation, and UNDP. Our third speaker, Professor Sri Krishna Deva Rao, will be joining us a little while from now. Today's sessions will be chaired by Honorable Vice Chancellor, Ravinshaw University, Professor Ishan Kumar Patro, and moderated by Dean, School of Life Sciences, Ravinshaw University, and Director, IQAC, Professor Pradipta Kumar Mahapatra. With this, I welcome the distinguished speakers and invite the chair to initiate the proceedings. Thank you.
Panda, Professor Soumendra Mohan Patnaik, Professor Mahapatra, our Dean, Professor Rao is supposed to join us very soon. Learned participants, ladies and gentlemen, scholars and students. The university, Ravinshaw University, takes the privilege of holding a week-long webinar series on the education policy, new education policy 2020, National Education Policy 2020, with special emphasis to lay down, discuss upon the strategies on implementation of this policy in Orissa in particular and the nation in general, and look into several aspects of the policy as such. We have already discussed on the curriculum. We will be discussing on research development. We had a discussion yesterday on symbiosis between technical education and higher education. We are going to listen today a bit of teacher education and regulation of education as such, and the governance today. And then we will continue to listen on the legal aspects of the policy and so on. The policy emphasizes on planning, delivery, governance and management, and monitoring and evaluation of education programs in this country. And what it indicates is it is made to promote holistic education, research, translation of knowledge, and knowledge generation in universities, making universities the hubs of great enterprise. And the policy proposes to the revision and revamping of all aspects of education, school and higher education. We will be dealing with higher education, including its regulation, governance, and continuum of a policy to making the call for legal attention as well. Talks of converging innovations also, and out of the box ideas, a thought on autonomy and empowerment of educational institutions. The four distinct roles of governance and regulation that have been emphasized are policy making, operation of education, ensuring quality and professionalism, academic and administration to be separated altogether to create better governance reforms and better academic environments. So there are many things written in that, because we have got today two experts, one to talk on the possibility of looking into implementation policies or strategies and governance, and another Professor Santosh Pandaji on the regulation part of it, because he has been one of the regulators of the recent past, is a former chairperson of National Council for Teacher Education. And so on. And I look forward to very interesting deliberation from two of our friends. And then Professor Rao will join us, the Vice Chancellor of the National Law University, Delhi. And we have requested him to discuss with us about the possible legal aspects of this policy and the document. Because anything you start doing new, the people who would be asking questions: why, how, when, and so many things, and then they put it to the possibility within the constitutional requirement of any individual or the institution as such. So with this in mind, I now call upon our esteemed colleagues, Professor Patnaik, Professor Panda, and Professor Rao, to have their deliberations. And if there are any suggestions and questions, they can be put into the chat box, which we will communicate with them over email. If time permits, we may be asking the questions right now. Namaskar, Professor Rao. Welcome.
Yes, sir. Good afternoon, sir.
Namaste. So with this, I request now Professor Mahapatra to take over. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is the third day, and let's have a great go. Thank you.
Invited guests to this seminar, and all those who are online to as audience to listen to the seminar. May I, at the beginning, request Professor Santosh Kumar Panda to deliver his lecture. So in the meantime, I think Professor Panda will join us later. May I now request Professor Soumendra Mohan Patnaik, Vice Chancellor, Utkal University, to speak on the topic national governance-related issues with reference to National Education Policy 2020. I request Professor Patnaik to deliver his lecture.
So, thank you everybody for bearing with me with this technological hitch. I think at the outset, I must express my sincere thanks and gratitude to our Honorable Vice Chancellor, Revensa University, Professor Ishan Patra, for always conceiving new ideas. And this is just one of the examples of how to discuss and reflect upon in a threadbare manner on the National Education Policy 2020, a series of events which he has organized, and I consider myself fortunate to be a part of it. Now, the policy, National Education Policy, I would like to understand it as a collective aspiration. a dream of the nation. And it's a vast terrain. And in this vast terrain, Honorable Vice Chancellor wanted me to speak on some governance related issues. And when I came to know that the inaugural session of this series was marked with the presence of none other than Professor Kasturi Rangan, the space scientist and eminent educationist, Professor Sahasra Buddhe, and Professor Pankaj Mittal, the main architect of higher education in India. The main architect of this policy, Professor Kasturi Rangan, is a space scientist, and therefore the canvas is very, very broad, very, very macroscopic. And at the same time, it is so precise and so much contained in terms of its appropriateness, like the cosmic order of the universe, which is held in utmost precision, and similar kind of experience one have when one goes through this vast terrain of higher education policy of India 2020. But at the same time, when our Honorable Vice Chancellor wanted me to speak on governance issues, it reminded me of my own profession, my alma mater, where I teach anthropology. And anthropology is a microcosmic science. It deals with the microcosm. It doesn't deal unfortunately, it should have, but unfortunately, it doesn't deal with macrocosm so far. There are areas where macrocosms are handled. So what is my understanding of this national education policy as far as the leadership and governance issues are concerned? Now, to do so, I will do it in 3 stages. Stage 1, I will try to discuss what is the dream of the nation, what is the imagination of the policymakers, what kind of higher education they want to envision or they want to envisage, what kind of universities and research institutes they want to visualize in coming 15 years. And in a way that how the governance of higher education should be sensitive to this kind of vision. For example, it is very important to know the vision of the higher education policy before we land up in governing it. So in the backdrop, I will have some reflections of my own as far as the vision of higher education policy, national education policy is concerned, with special reference to higher education. The second part, I will primarily discuss the governance and leadership issues, connecting it to the part one. And in doing so, I have gone for a content analysis of this particular section, a thematic analysis of this particular section. And I will return to it at an appropriate time. And the third section, I would like to reflect upon how this whole issue of governance, finds its root either in a global pitch or in an Indian pitch. How this national education policy has Indian roots or roots in a local context, maybe in Odisha, maybe in some other space. So, coming to the first part, we all know that what we are imagining and what we are envisioning is nothing but a very different kind of higher education institutions, a very, very innovative kind of higher education institutions, which are not compartmentalized, which are not fragmented, which do not believe in putting knowledge into compartmentalized divisions. And therefore, it envisions an education system with large multidisciplinary higher education institutions by 2040. It clearly says that it creates large multidisciplinary higher education institutions with optimal use of infrastructure and resources. And what is the outcome? Interesting outcome for a social scientist, that it wants to produce vibrant multidisciplinary communities. I mean, the idea of community is so beautifully woven into these higher education institutions. And if we miss this word, that it wants to create vibrant multidisciplinary communities, and we will miss it. Nalanda was a community. Takshila was a community. It attracted the people to come and stay there, to contemplate, to explore the terrains of knowledge, and to go for the quest for knowledge, and to go for adventure of ideas not in a shallow or in a vacuum, but in terms of real experiences and real quest for knowledge acquisition. This is one of the imaginations. The second imagination, which I would like to highlight out of many, that there should be an increasing faculty and institutional autonomy. And this is very, very crucial. It's very, very central to our policy framework, because unless we talk of an faculty autonomy and institutional autonomy, we cannot pursue the quest for knowledge. And therefore, at the heart of the teaching learning exercise, the philosophy is the faculty autonomy and the uniqueness of each student. Every student is unique. Every student do not require same tailoring, same kind of mentoring. It requires different prescriptions. As the supervisor of many PhD students, all of us know that for some students, we ask them to write less, and for some students, we ask them to write more. But if they go and tell outside that the same teacher tells in a PhD to condense and to another person to expand, they forget that different patients, I'm not using the word for a student, but in a medical profession, different patients are given different prescriptions. So when there is a autonomy of the faculty, and when there is a belief that each student is divergent, each student is diverse, and it has its own need, the community, the multidisciplinary community, produces these kind of teaching learning atmosphere with increased faculty and institutional autonomy. And what is Imagine? I think Professor Panda was mentioning about it. I could not hear him properly because of my network problem. And what he was mentioning, he was referring to is the governance of higher education institutions by highly qualified and independent boards. And these independent boards are board of governors having academic and administrative autonomy. And this is the formula of creating institutions of excellence. That how the board of governors should have academic and administrative autonomy. The higher education policy, the national education policy uses a very captive term, that light but tight regulatory bodies. It is light but tight regulatory bodies by a single regulator for higher education bodies, and that single regulation is the Central Advisory Board of Education and the Higher Education Commission of India, two important bodies. And there are several bodies to which we will come to in a minute. But the apex body regulating the higher education in India, and within that we have National Research Foundation, which strongly recommends the peer-reviewed research in the university setup and therefore funds them. National Research Foundation for funding peer-reviewed and cutting-edge research. At the same time, there are also 4 verticals of the Higher Education Commission of India, each one governing a separate aspect, an independent aspect. What are those areas? National Higher Education Regulatory Council, National Accreditation Council, Higher Education Grants Council, and General Education Council. The 4 verticals: Regulatory Council, Accreditation Council, Grants Council, and General Education Council under Higher Education Commission of India. So there is an apparently restructuring of the governance mechanism, and this restructuring is done at various levels. At the level of top apex central level, at the level of a particular domain, at the level of a particular vertical, there is a regulatory framework, and also at the level of central and state universities. So the point which boils down here is to the Board of Governors. Now, these Board of Governors who regulate the universities at the level of top apex bodies within the institutions, how it is understood by national education policy. I'm not going to touch upon the macroscopic domain, which maybe Professor Panda or other people are dealing with. I'm not going to tell where I do not have much experience in terms of National Research Foundation, National Higher Education Regulatory Council, but I will mainly confine to my experience as a Vice Chancellor, or my experience as leading the so-called Board of Governors or syndicate at the level of a university in a microscopic way, in an intense humanistic way, so as to reflect upon the policy of National Education 2020. Now, it is imagined that the higher education institutions need to have autonomy. And how autonomy is understood? Autonomy is understood. I'll return to autonomy towards my conclusion. And how autonomy is understood? Autonomy is understood primarily in terms of three important parameters. One, the academic parameters. It has its decision, or it has its autonomy to decide the course. The first one is, I think I lost my connection. So the first one is the academic autonomy. And in this academic autonomy, you have, the institution, higher education institution has the right to decide about the new courses, new curriculum, to revise the curriculum, to decide on the pedagogy, to decide on the evaluation system, and also to decide on certification, creating off-campus, other matters. When it comes to administrative autonomy, it mainly revolves around the appointment, the recruitment, the teachers' recruitment, and also taking important administrative decisions about the promotions, about the streamlining of the system, and finally, the last one is the financial autonomy, where it is not dependent on any particular organization, external organization, which will require certain kind of favors from them in return of the financial support. This is not going to happen, and this is clearly sealed at this point, that universities should develop its own mechanism of generating finances, managing finances, and spending finances, and also saving it for the rainy days. So look at most of the Ivy League universities. The Ivy League universities are not universities in terms of their teaching excellence, but they are Ivy League because of their great financial autonomy, of their great financial independence, that they are not dependent on anybody. If you get admission into an Ivy League university, you are bound to get a fellowship. Otherwise, without fellowship, there are no PhD admissions. Without fellowships, there are no entry into the university. So they ensures that the right kind of people come and right kind of people stay here, to whom they mentor, they groom by providing the right kind of financial support. Having said this, that autonomy of higher education institutions have to be understood in terms of academic, administrative, and financial resources. Let me come to reflect upon how this Board of Governors look like. This Board of Governors, or the BOG, is enshrined in this new education policy, looks like 10 to 20 members. 1/3 of it is usually from the higher education institutions. Not more than 3 government nominees. This, depending on the government and depending on the higher education institutions, this could be maximum 3 but it will make a difference if it is 3 out of 10 or if it is 3 out of 20 or 3 out of 15. So that blending has to be arrived at by the respective governments and by the higher education institutions. But most important point here is, in addition to 1/3 members from higher education institutions who are academicians and up to 3 nominees from the government, the others are from alumni, very welcome step. Others are from local communities, elected representatives, or important civil society actors, or important citizens, responsible citizens who have empathy for the institution, who feel for the university, who have a sense of ownership of the universities, and finally, people from industry, from CSR and others, those who can fund it without any hidden agenda, and they can make things explicit, they can make things very, very transparent. And the last point is that when we talk about this board of governors, the mechanism of public accountability has to be ensured. And this mechanism of public accountability is usually ensured by a larger body, which the NEP 2020 says, court. University of Delhi, where I teach, also has a court where the lawyers are members, the doctors are members, the artists are members, elected teacher representative are members, there are civil servants are members. So court is the highest body. Court is like the microcosm of the society. Court is the microcosm of the society before which the board of governors are answerable, before which the vice chancellor is answerable, before which the person above the vice chancellor is also answerable. Who chairs the court? In University of Delhi, the court is always chaired by the chancellor, and therefore it's a highest body having great public accountability, and this public accountability has been maintained by the National Education Policy 2020. This takes care of my first part. Now, having said that this is the first part, I now come to the second part. Now, in the second part, of course, I'm a small person, nobody is going to ask me, but if anybody asks me that how this national education policy can be executed, I remember the story of Lord Shiva asking Ganesh and Kartikeya to take the round of the whole world and come back fast. While Kartik was using the peacock to take a very swift round, Ganesh used the rat to take a round of Lord Shiva and said that I have completed my term. We should not be worried about how to make higher education institutions. Certainly not. We should follow this particular approach, that if we are having 850 higher education institutions in public universities, let us identify 850 leaders of excellence. If 100 crores of Indian population, or more than 1.25 crore of Indian population, we cannot identify 850 individuals, then I think as a nation, we have not done well in our last 70 years of journey. It boils down to identifying the right kind of vice chancellor and identifying the right kind of leader. And that is what the new education policy very clearly tells us in the section on effective governance and leadership, on which my esteemed colleague, Professor Ishan Patra, wanted me to speak. Now, I have done a thematic analysis and I have done a content analysis of this particular section, howsoever brief this section may be. And I will try to identify some of the themes which this particular section explores, and how these themes can be more meaningful in the context of an Indian university, or in the context of a university in Odisha, or in the context of a university in any of the states. Now, it clearly says that the main idea is to promote the culture of excellence and innovation. And this culture of excellence and innovation has to be promoted, has to be created by or through a strong mechanism of self-governance. A strong mechanism of self-governance, sovereignty of the institutions, and autonomy of the institutions. And this can be done on the basis of outstanding merit-based appointment. And when we are saying that the outstanding merit-based appointment, I was reminded of one of the best quotes which we always find in the ancient work of Machiavelli, The Prince. There he says that it is not the titles that honor men, but it is the men that honor the titles. If the Nobel laureates or if the Nobel Prize is not populated by such a brand of people, the prize has no meaning. I repeat, it is not the titles that honor men, but men that honors the title. The office of Vice Chancellor should not offer a man, but a man should honor the title by accepting it to become the Vice Chancellor or accept it to become the CEO of higher education institutions. Strong self-governance and outstanding merit-based appointments. And the board of governors should have a strong sense of commitment and commitment to institutions. And let me tell you a frank confession, in my last 3 years of tenure as Utkal University, the highest decision-making body, syndicate, I'm extremely thankful to all my syndicate members who worked with me at some point or other for demonstrating highest level of commitment to institutions. And it is, I want to really take this opportunity of thanking them, because they have really acted as a conscience keeper of administrators, and such a strong commitment to institutions is very rarely found. And if we can select similar kind of people who have strong sense of commitment and who are free from any external influence, and this external influence means that there is no other force which rules over the conscience of these people, and therefore at that level the governance structure needs to be completely autonomous. Now, one point comes to my mind very strikingly. While the new policy is talking of the Board of Governors, it also identifies the mechanism of its formation. What is it saying all about? It says that the new members of the board should be identified by an expert committee. And this expert committee is appointed by the Board of Governors. And this Board of Governors, who appoints an expert committee to identify the new members for the Board of Governors, it is also appointed by the Board of Governors. It reminds me of a very famous phrase from the French philosophy, sui generis, S-U-I-G-E-N-E-R-I-S, a term which was used by Émile Durkheim to explain the relationship between individual and society. Now, the collectivity of individuals coming together, they create certain norms for themselves. And these norms which they create, they are no more dependent on the individual. And they are having a regulatory effect on the individual. They create a collective space, a space in which individuals are controlled by those rules, but at the same time, individuals have created these rules. Sui generis means self-generating system, automatically generating system. So I repeat, new members of Board of Governors are to be identified by an expert committee appointed by the Board of Governors, and the Board of Governors will appoint the new members by themselves. And therefore, look at the mechanism of sui generis. The self-generating system, not dependent on any external influence, not dependent on any economic lobby or any political lobby, not dependent on any other forces outside it, but on a forces of its own. But that the force of its own, the BOG, contains government representative, it contains representative of the civil society, it contains representative of the industry. It's the microcosm of the society. It is the aspirations of the society. It contains the local leaders. It contains the local citizens. And therefore, the sui generis is very important. And it reminds me of a very famous quotation that that some of the indigenous communities practice, that like produces the like. And when you say like produces the like, I want to say it is excellence which reproduces itself. Any amount of mediocrity there will really mar the soul, and it only mediocrity breeds mediocrity, and excellence reproduces itself. And that is why when we identify this board of governors as a set of excellent people, then only we can ensure that it will produce itself in an excellent way. But if that is not taken care of, then there is a big challenge. There is a big challenge. Next point, higher education institutions are also to be incentivized, supported, and mentored till 2035, because it envisages a 15 years of roadmap. When we had a meeting with our Honorable Chancellor in Odisha, from Utkal University, the office of the Chancellor told us, much before the policy was executed, the Honorable Chancellor told us that plan out a roadmap. Maybe it was because the state of Odisha is going to celebrate its centenary in 2036, 16 years from now, and planning the educational institutions up to 15th year from now is really a great cause and a great commitment and a great requirement on all of us. Anybody who comes from this part of the country, the eastern part of the country, that when the state is celebrating centenary, how do we want to see the higher education institutions? Are we not interested in seeing them as multidisciplinary communities with large infrastructure, with a huge presence in the civil life of the city, of the state, and with all facilities, the way most of the Western countries or most of the United States universities look like? I don't want to imitate them. But some of the best infrastructural and majesticity of the things in terms of equipment, technology, infrastructure cannot be ignored. Now, having said this, that what we need in terms of effective governance, let me come to the thematic analysis of what should be the quality of these 850 odd leaders of higher education institutions. I think that is very difficult task to understand. The policy clearly tells us. It is like looking for an ideal bride. The community wants that the bride should be vested with all domestic qualities at the same time, all professional qualities. Look at the idea of leadership which the nation wants from the higher education institutions. I don't want to say that people are not available, but I want to say that it is a very, very high demanding job. I don't want to say that good brides and ideal brides are not there. Many women are proving it very, very effectively, both in domestic domain and in professional domain. And somehow the glass ceiling is working, but that's a different story altogether. But what I'm trying to say is that in Indian context, the CEO of an institution has to be Sarvaguna Sampanna. What are the qualities we envisage? High academic qualifications. There has to be great achievement. Like somebody has to be Bhatnagar Award, somebody has to be, the great Raman Fellowship, and there are many, many, many interesting awards, high academic qualifications. And after having obtained the high academic qualifications, the person is expected to have demonstrated administrative and leadership capabilities. These are very, 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 very unique combinations. And, I will tell you a very small narrative from the grassroots that in Utkal University, for non-teaching staff, the Saturdays are off, but second Saturday and fourth Saturday. But for teaching staff, the Saturdays are working days. And I always used to live in a dilemma when my colleagues ask me, when my family members ask me, that you are going on second Saturday, you are also going on fourth Saturday. I said, I'm not a non-teaching member. But they asked me, you are not taking classes? What are you doing there? How come you are saying that you are teaching? This is a dilemma. This is an oxymoronic thing. And this oxymoron has to be understood, it has to be solved, and it has to be transcended. I don't want to believe in the compartmentalization of somebody is teaching and somebody is not teaching. This is all artificial creation, because a teacher is not confined only to the classroom. A teacher is a role model, and many of the non-teaching staffs are better teachers in life for our own students. I don't believe in these kind of things. But when we say that a high academic qualifications with demonstrated administrative and leadership capabilities, then there has to be adequate thought process which should be given in future, that how do we want to see the activities of the Vice Chancellor. Whether the activities of the Vice Chancellor should be confined only to administration, or also to significant contribution to teaching and research. But having talked about this kind of dilemma, I was also thinking that I do not know whether I'll be able to do it or not, but I was thinking that there should be an academic office of the Vice Chancellor, an academic office where when the Vice Chancellor is sitting there and studying for 2 hours in a day, others should not disturb, or some kind of intellectual activities going on. Having said this, one of the requirement of the leadership position in the new education policy, very interesting theme which comes up here, abilities to manage and solve and deal with complex situations. What exactly is understood when you say complex situations? I think it reminds me of the definition of a university. If somebody tells me that university is only a place for study, I may not be very satisfied with this. If somebody tells me that university is a space which is non-political and it is only a space which is academic, I will find it difficult to believe. Then what is university all about? I think university is a complex phenomenon. And this complex phenomenon has to be understood by using 3 templates or 3 ideal types. What are the 3 ideal types I want you to pay attention to? One is the ideal type of a family. The second one is the ideal type of the government organizations. The third one is the ideal type of corporations, industries. One is the government, and the other one is the private corporations and private industries, and the third one is the family. University is neither a government organization, nor an industrial organization, nor somebody's private family. Unfortunately, we have not been able to arrive at a perfect blending of these 3. I would like to argue, as far as I want to understand the meaning of an university, university is part family, part government, and part industry or part corporations. And therefore, it is very important to understand the complexity of the structure of university. Here, the rules are never broken. What we expect is the rules should be stretched to the maximum to accommodate the growing up students' fault. When the students are growing up, they are growing up like children. They are children of the family. And we are not police officers. We are not strict disciplinarian. We will understand their energy. We will understand their aspirations. We will understand their naughtiness. We have all committed naughty things when we were students. How can we expect that students to be pure, pristine in terms of disciplinary things? No, that's certainly not desirable. That could be desirable in a government organization. That could be desirable in an army setup, but it's not desirable in an educational setup. Some of my colleagues said that you should also find out how teachers are teaching. I said, I'm not a police to find out how the teachers are teaching. I trust my colleagues and they must be teaching well. And if they are not teaching well, it is up to their conscience to believe whether they are teaching well or they are not teaching well. We are not here for policing. We are here as a catalyst, and it is therefore it is a part family. But at the same time, if somebody doesn't come to the office regularly, somebody is regularly irregular, you have to act like the strict government officer. And if somebody is not delivering in terms of output, you have to act like strict corporate manager. And therefore it's a combination of, it's a part family, part corporation, part government. And this is a complex situation, and this requires highly skilled individuals who can really solve the problem and who can transform the future citizens of India when they are still struggling how to find out a role model. They are struggling to find a role model. Show them a role model. The role of a chief executive officer of the higher education institution is not to promote only the research, but to promote the quality of human character that the nation is producing ahead of time, and that is more important. And therefore, the person should have strong social commitment to the constitutional values, and he should be in a position to align the higher education governor or the chief executive officer of the vice chancellor should be able to align the constitutional values with that of the vision of the institution. Vision of the institution. The vision of the institution is something which we need to combine very strongly. He should be able to work in a team, which team is diverse, team is pluralistic, with great diversity, and he should be a person of a teamwork. He should be a team person. Having said this, when we say that he should be a team worker, what is the definition of a team? How to build up a team? I remember that I'll come back to this in my third part. Please remind me about this question, that how to build up a team and how the team leader should select the people who are going to be identified. What is more important, the last point in this second part, before I conclude my portion quickly in third part, I think I have another 5-6 minutes to wind up, because I was told that I can go up to 40 minutes. So the last point in part 2 about the leadership, effective leadership, is we need to plan out the successor. This is very important. Who will succeed whom? And unless we plan out that succession, all our efforts are going to fall flat. Somebody was telling us that many of the World Bank programs and RUSA programs, they are time bound. So we should plan up to that particular time. I said that is ridiculous. The program may come to an end because the money is not available. But universities should ensure some other sources to run these programs. And whether a person continues as the head of the institution or not, whether a person remains as the CEO or not, the program should continue. Why should we waste 3 years of our time in starting a program which will come to an end when the budgetary allocations are over? That means we have not been able to understand that program very well. The program was a hand-holding exercise for us. And that hand-holding exercise, we should be able to stand on our own feet in terms of collecting extramural funding. And that is something which is very important, leadership succession. And leadership succession has to be planned with great care. And here, the Board of Governors are very important, that the Board of Governors should plan it out with great care, that in a way, that a change in leadership does not lead to cessation of good practices, doesn't lead to discontinuity of good practices, but it leads to continuity of these good practices with greater innovation, with greater input. Under no circumstances the leadership positions should stand vacant or it should be limped. There should not be any situation where there is a limping leader for a longer time, or there should be a vacancy in the leadership position, because that creates different effect. And that is very clear in the National Education Policy 2020, that there should not be any vacancy. There should be greater planning for leadership. And one more point, National education policy tells us that if possible, let us make sufficiently overlapping periods. Now, suppose an outgoing vice chancellor has 6 months to go and a new incumbent is identified 6 months before. Look at the alchemy that is going to take place between two of them. That between two of them there would be a greater understanding of intellectual inputs, and there would be greater chemistry, that what the outgoing incumbent is doing and what the incoming incumbent is expecting. There would be a perfect blending of ideas, and the Board of Governors can play an important role. I have seen many of the international organizations like Rotary International and all, the governor of a district, and usually in Odisha there are 2 or 3 districts of Rotary. In the Rotary, the governor, there is a governor-elect, a governor in waiting, that if I am elected as a governor of Rotary in 2020, I know that I will take up my responsibility in 2021. I have sufficient time to plan. The university is not enrolling me. University is not enrolling the new incumbent, not paying him, but making him cautious that, look, you are going to join us after 6 months. Why can't we do it? And that is something which is the new education policy has enshrined very, very clearly, with sufficient overlapping of outgoing vice chancellor and incoming vice chancellor. And that is possible only when you have a strong roadmap for a long plan, the IDP, institutional development plan for institutional development plan, which is for 15 years. And this 15 years institutional development plan should be done by taking into account participation of all stakeholders, teachers, students, industry, community, political leaders, bureaucrats, and civil society institutions. The high standards of financial probity and accountability is also the desirable quality of the leader. But most important thing is that most of the universities which are aiming to internationalize, they should not forget that internationalization is possible only when you have a strong local pride. Now, if you are not committed to the local community, and if you are not committed to the local space, no international community would look towards you, because it is only the local which sells in the global market. Global doesn't sell in the global market. Global market requires the local flavor, and that is where we should not commit a mistake. Finally, the last part, when I will conclude, I would like to wind up by saying that this new education policy, as far as the idea of governance is concerned, it deals with a central issue of excellence and autonomy. And this excellence and autonomy has to be understood in terms of a perfect combination between meritocracy and democracy. Now, there has to be a perfect blending of excellence and equity. When we travel in the road of excellence, we should be inclusive. It should not be exclusive. And this is also a very, what should I say, fine edge of balance. When I say that you have to maintain a balance between excellence and equity, when you have to make excellence as inclusive. Now, look at how some of the universities in South Asia and Southeast Asia are handling this issue. I was really very surprised that in the National University of Singapore, Singapore has produced many homegrown scholars, but at the same time, those homegrown scholars of those who are Singaporean or Bangkok has produced, this Hong Kong has produced many homegrown scholars. What they have done, that they have invited the best mind of the world to their university and have created a confluence where the best minds are exposed in or along with the Singaporean minds. So what I'm trying to say is that by juxtaposing the excellence with inclusivity, by juxtaposing the meritocracy with democratic values, we can really create wonders. And that is something which the new education policy is trying to strive towards, or it should come out more excellent, more explicitly and more concretely. And finally, I would say that when we talk about autonomy, and autonomy is a double-edged weapon. Autonomy is a double-edged weapon because it can create further excellence, or it can lead to further devastation. One of the first dialogues is that one of the quotes which I remember is that bad leadership is a costly epidemic. If a leader is bad, the institution has to pay through the nose, and this is something which autonomy creates in terms of a double-edged weapon. And when it talks of autonomy, and when I'm talking of meritocracy and democracy, I would like to have this whole idea of, autonomy versus sovereignty. The sovereignty of the state, within that there is an autonomous institutions, and therefore I don't see any contradiction. I don't see any contradiction that a sovereign state has given autonomy to the institutions like universities, and universities should not misuse it. And when we talk about what is the Indian way of understanding, I am reminded of Kautilya's Arthashastra, where the Saptanga theory tells us that the sovereign king has its own amatya, or the council of ministers, with Janapada, people and territory, students and hostels, Durga, the fortification, the security, the wall around the university, the Kosha, the treasury, the Danda, the discipline, and also the Mitra, the allies, the collaborations. This whole model of statecraft, which derives on sovereignty, can also be applied to an autonomous model. And this autonomous model has to take into account the various components which Indian philosophers have thought 2,500 years before, or 2,300 years before, because this Arthashastra was 300 BC, something around that time. And the last point which I would like to say, that when we talk about most of the good practices of the West, one of the good practices of the West could come from the tenure track system. Now we have here 1 year of probation, and that the assessment after probation becomes highly routinized. I think instead of going for a routinized assessment, we should go for a performance-based assessment, and something like a tenure track system, that somebody who has delivered and somebody who has, I think Delhi School of Economics started this long ago when we were students. They tried to appoint people as research associate for 5 years, and then within that, or after the completion of the 5 years, the person was picked up as a reader, or the person was dropped like a hot potatoes. So you have given an individual 5 years to perform. So this tenure track system, or a modified version of tenure track system, is desirable because the danda, or the discipline, is an important component of governance. And the last point which I would like to say, that what kind of citizens India would like to produce. India do not want to produce citizens like West, who are atomized, decontextualized, highly individualistic. No, Indian citizens are well connected to the family, well connected to the community, well connected to the nation. And that connectedness is a multi-layered phenomenon. It's not a uni-layered phenomenon. And this multi-layered phenomenon, because the Indian philosophy tells us about the Panchkos theory of education. And many of the philosophers have talked of Panchkos theory of education. Vivekananda, Sri Aurobindo, Gandhi, they have all reflected on the similar line. And this punch course means 5 seats of the personality, 5 layers of the personality, 5 layers of embodiment of the citizens. The first layer is the Annamaya course, the food layer. The second layer is the Pranamaya course, the vital layer. The third is the Manomaya course, the mental layer. The fourth one is the Vijnanamaya course, the intellectual layer, which we deal with mainly in the higher education. And final one, fifth one is the Anandamaya course, the layer of the bliss. When higher education institutions or national education policy have emphasized on the principles of liberal arts and aesthetics and music and fine arts, that is the blissful experience which the national education policy tries to blend with the hardcore rigor scientific pursuits. And that is something where a integral development of the personality of the students come up, integral development of the personality of the teachers come up, because teachers are also still learning about technology. And I was telling you that a National Education Technology Forum has been created for better governance, and this National Education Technology Forum is teaching the teachers how to take online classes and all. In the last line, I would like to say that having said that excellence is a double-edged weapon, I would like to conclude that universities are systems within the larger social system, or universities are parts of the larger social systems. And universities are continuously under the public gaze. The public is looking at them. They are under a public gaze, and they are not free from gaze. Everybody is judging the universities. So excellence need not be achieved only, but it must appear to have been achieved in the eyes of wider society. When the wider society believes that a particular university has achieved excellence, that is the success of an institution. The selection committee is accountable to the society, what kind of people one selects after 20 years, where they are going to take the universities, and therefore excellence requires to be a highly transparent phenomenon in terms of the larger audience of society. And that is where the imagination of the nation in terms of new education policy finds concrete manifestation in terms of few themes, in terms of few sentences, but it has been owned up by a larger audience, larger community, the whole of nation. Thank you very much. Thanks to Professor Patra and all the organizers for giving me this chance. And any questions, I'm there after my speakers. Thank you.
In comment box, I do not see any question. Maybe if there will be any question, you can come to this later.
Okay.
Before I go to the next speaker, I will just make a small summary of the excellent deliberation of Professor Patnaik. There were so much of phrases in the comment box regarding the lecture of Professor Patnaik. People have appreciated it like anything. Making a brief summary of what Professor Patnaik told about the policy of, about the national higher education policy, that the education policy aims at building institutions, higher education institutions, which will be of multidisciplinary type without having any compartments, building barrierless interdisciplinary interface, and it will have the opportunity of making the best use of infrastructure and resources. With regard to the governance and autonomy of the higher education institutions, he stressed upon the autonomy, and this autonomy has to be understood for the excellence of higher education institutions. And he spoke on 3 distinct aspects, main aspects of autonomy: the academic, that is, which decides on courses, curricula, contents, pedagogy, evaluation, creativity, and the activities inside the campus. With regard to administrative, the autonomy should be on determining the academic hierarchy, recruitment, and promotion, and also not doing the confirmation of performance as a routine exercise, rather making proper and rigorous assessment on the basis of performance of the teacher or the faculty who is recruited to the university system. Also, he spoke on financial autonomy in creating the resources and in developing mechanism for generation, spending, and management of funds, and making the higher education institutions less and less dependent on external fundings, and making it strong enough to generate the funding of its own. He also stressed upon the leadership and governance, that it is most important to determine a good leader, to select, identify a good leader, and 850 good leaders for 850 institutions can bring excellence. He also stressed upon the strong commitment of the leaders as well as the members of the governing body who will be taking care of the higher institutions, and stressed upon making proper funding for the 15 years to come to make this higher education policy, a dream of higher education policy of the government, fruitful. He stressed upon the contribution of all stakeholders who will be there in the governing body of higher education institutions, and with regard to implementing the higher education policy, the Higher Education Commission of India has 4 wings, and he stressed upon all these 4 wings: the Higher Education Commission, the National Education Commission, National Accreditation Commission, National Grant Council, and General Higher Education Council. He spoke a lot, and I cannot. I think it is not necessary for me to repeat what Professor Patnaik spoke. I thank him very much for his consent and for coming here and giving such a nice lecture to all the participants and all the audiences. Now I request Professor Ponda. I think things will go well with this time. I request Professor Ponda to speak on this topic.
Am I audible, sir?
Yes, sir, you're audible now.
Oh, thank you very much. So I'm very sorry that I got disconnected when I started. Thank you, Professor Soumya Patnaik. Professor.
I'm really privileged to introduce Professor Krishna Deva Rao, Vice Chancellor of National Law University, New Delhi, and former Vice Chancellor of National Law University, Odisha. Professor Krishna Deva Rao was a member of our IPUSC Advisory Committee during his stay as Vice Chancellor of National Law University, Odisha, and was a regular visitor to Ravenshaw University campus. I am really privileged to introduce Professor Krishna Deva Rao. Professor Rao has contributed a lot to justice and has significant research in preventing custodial deaths. Professor Rao recently received the highest award in the field of criminology, Kumarappa Reckless Award, for his outstanding contribution in criminal justice and education in India by the National Society of Criminology, Chennai, in February 2020. A Fulbright scholar, Professor Rao has the distinction of working with 5 prestigious law universities in India for the past 3 decades, namely the National Law University, Odisha, the National Law School of India, Bangalore, Nalsar University of Law, Hyderabad, Gujarat National Law University, Gandhinagar, and now National Law University, Delhi. He was a visiting fellow at the University of Washington, Seattle in 2012, and at School of Oriental and African Studies, South London in 2013. He was very actively engaged in human rights teaching and research, and was sponsored by the NHRC in 1994 to participate in human rights course at the International Institute of Human Rights, Strasbourg, France. He has also collaborated with many research projects of UKERI, UNDP, Law Commission of India, and Ministry of Law and Justice. And I thank Professor Rao for accepting our invitation to participate in this webinar and also deliver his lecture. Now I request Professor Rao to speak on the topic. Professor Rao,
Thank you.
please.
Thank you. Professor Ishan Patro, Vice Chancellor, Ravenshaw University. Professor Santosh Panda, former colleague at Indira Gandhi National Open University, former chairperson of the National Council for Teachers Education. Professor Soumendra Mohan Patnaik, Vice Chancellor, Utkal University. Professor P.K. Mahapatra and friends. When Professor Patro has invited me, I was not sure the destiny will bring me to this National University, Delhi. Thank you, Professor Patro, for giving me this opportunity to share some of my views. I would like to look at how law schools should understand the National Education Policy 2020 and how they should take forward. I think some of you are aware about this new animal called as national law schools or national law universities. If you look at the NEP 2020 visualizes broadly three types of universities: research intensive university, teaching intensive university, autonomous degree conferring universities. And national law universities, surprisingly, have all these three important features. Because when the National Law School started, 1980s, and late 1970s and early 1980s, there was a lot of discussion how to improve the standards of the legal education. They were looking at the best models in the United States, UK, several other countries. And once upon a time, we have a great lawyers. We have the lawyers, those who participated in the freedom movement, they also have taken a lot of interest in the national building of India, even the Constitutional Assembly debates. And after the Constitution has been started, implemented and enforceable, so we have a great role played by a lawyers. But we have seen after the Advocates Act and the Bar Council of India, and also after primarily from the 1970s onwards and early 1980s. And also we should look at 1980s is in the both economic, political, social history of all over the world, including India, globalization as a phenomenon started developing. And also the WTO and other, there's a lot of need for a great, solid, robust legal education. I think that was the time the Bar Council of India started thinking about how do we create a uni-faculty universities like the national law schools or national law universities. So that's a history. So therefore, if you look at national law schools are teaching intensive. It's an amazing teaching. In fact, the method of teaching, it's overloaded if you wanted to call. Teachers sometimes run away from the universities because unlike the conventional universities, they have to be not only Professor Madhav Meena, who is the founder of the National Law School movement in India, and also Professor Upendra Basi, who conceptualized in 1980s socially relevant legal education. Both of them, they have visualized a teaching intensive university, research intensive university, and they don't want this national law school as a part of a conventional university. So therefore, I argue that whatever the NEP 2020 is saying, and most of these are part of the national law school curriculum, teaching methodology, and several others. So I wanted to just reflect on some of the key ideas of the new National Education Policy 2020. You have to forgive me borrowing more examples from the legal education. I must thank and confess Professor Ishan Patro for giving me opportunity seriously to reflect upon how NEP will help the law universities to really become a global, excellent, world-class universities. So that's where I'll begin. And as I said, the law schools follow first principle is intellectual, eternal curiosity and dialogue. That's the first principle. As I said, it's a single faculty university. And we will come to that. The major challenge the NLUs have to face along with the other universities, particularly the law schools, is how we should transform from a single faculty law discipline to the multidisciplinary universities or multidisciplinary curriculum and other. First, let me begin with multidisciplinarity and holistic learning in the national law schools. This 5-year integrated program of BA LLB Honors is one of the established program, beginning with, if you look at the National Law School of India, University Bangalore, which started offering the first 5-year integrated program in India, 1988. After 10 years, the Chief Justice of India, the law ministers, Chief Justice of the respective high courts realized there's a need to replicate the National Law School model all over the world. That's how after 10 years, in fact, we must thank the Orissa. This conference was organized in Bhubaneswar, where in 1986, the Chief Justice of India, the law ministers, the Chief Justice of the respective high courts realize and acknowledge the replication of the National Law School Bangalore model. That's how in 1988, the Bhopal and Hyderabad and others started coming up. So most of this BA LLB, the integrated, if you could see, the multidisciplinarity was a part of the National Law School's birth itself. The integrating the social sciences, what we call as a 5-year integrated BA LLB Honors, was a best example. In fact, that time in 1988, they have also started developing exclusive textbooks for the law students. So the social sciences subjects were taught in the first 2 years, and they attempted to encourage teaching of social sciences even later on. But it depends upon the best of the teachers. If the teacher in the law school can utilize this opportunity, exemplify their scholarship, excellence, teaching, and other, naturally they can even come back and then also become one of the best teachers, compete with the law school law teachers. So there's nothing like a distinction between law and social science teacher, but the method is to learn the political science, economics, sociology, history, including English, have been part of the law school curriculum. And in the law schools, I'll come back to that when we look at the teaching methods and the best practices we have started. In the 4th and 5th years, the law schools have started electives, seminars, clinical courses, several methods of experiential learning. Later on, some law schools started not just confining to BA LLB Honors, they started experimenting with BBA LLB Honors. So the next method of interdisciplinarity in the law school started with the integrating management, commerce and management into the law schools. But I must admit that was not a successful experiment, even though NLU Odisha we have, Jodhpur has, and some other, but BBA LLB is one of the outstanding contribution of the national law schools to the multidisciplinarity of the legal education. And some law schools tried with BSc LLBs. One law school still is fighting how we integrate social work with the law school. In fact, for some point of time, the Tata Institute of Social Science, Bombay, NLS Bangalore, and some of us want to bring in social work, integrating. Hopefully, NEP 2020 will really pave a new pathway of social work and law integration. So that is one of the multidisciplinarity. Second aspect is teaching methods. I think I studied, like most of you, in a conventional law college. 3 years LLB and then 2 years LLM. We have not been introduced some of these American teaching method we call as a case law method, and which was used primarily in the United States, UK, and several other countries. That's a fascinating method of learning the law. And that creates, that develops what we call as a critical thinking skills, analytics skills, reasoning skills, and also argumentation skills, which are primarily required for a lawyer. If I have to teach a constitutional law, I'll select 20 cases. In India, one of the excellent decisions of the Indian Supreme Court, High Courts, American Supreme Court, South African Supreme Court, several other. And through that, I'll teach the selected articles of the Indian Constitution or other, how the international developments, international constitutional law impacted on the Indian constitutional law and other decisions. So case law method, which the National Law Universities is a part of. We teach primarily through the case law method, but while teaching the case law, we bring in the statute, whether it is the Indian Constitution or other criminal law and other things. So we will bring in all these together. So the best teaching method we use is the case law method. Curriculum. And Professor Soumendra Patnaik was mentioning about autonomy. In fact, I used to tell, and I realized when I started in 1990 into the teaching in the National Law School of India, University of Bangalore, I was surprised. Professor Madhav Menon said, you are going to teach this course, taught law, for the first years, and you design your own course. I was not aware how to design, what to do. And literally, he took me into the library. He took a, how do you decide it? He said, in the Bachelor of Education or the teacher training institutes, they will tell you, they will train you, orient you, how you have to develop your teaching class, how you have to develop lesson plan. So literally, in the initial formative years of the National Law School, Bangalore, we have learned several of these education development, education technology, and several other things. And Professor Menon took me to the library and he said, how do you develop your course? Pick up the landmark, the classic textbooks, used all over the world. Look at the Indian case laws, look at the statute, identify, see in the library, look at what are the cases, put them together, you prepare. He used to, olden times in 1990, used to be a stencil. He used to give a lesson, a complete trimester was the National Law School pattern. So 3 months, starting from, if you are beginning from August 1st to till month, he used to give every day there is, and you have to say, this year, this day I'll teach this topic, and this is my reading material. That was the meticulous planning. In fact, that is what the Bangalore National Law School model is used by all the law schools with innovation, creativity, and other. So another one is the curriculum is very important. And I never realized, because we know in the conventional universities, Board of Studies will be there 3 years. I know there are revision. Nobody prevents a teacher to reinvent the curriculum, but we follow mostly whatever the Board of Studies. But the National Law School invent, and National Law School seriously update. And every time the teacher is autonomous to design the course. Nobody will interfere, but he has to present, he or she has to present before the commencement of the semester, what is the course they are planning, what are the materials they wanted to use. And now we encourage use of audiovisual method, MOOCs, videos, Coursera, edX, several things which are available. The second aspect is experiential learning. Experiential learning, we know, Rabindranath Tagore, Jiddu Krishnamurti, and then we have heard of several of these. They have emphasized on how to learn from the experience. So we have experiential learning skills, and we also started National Law Schools have a public service also as one of the mandate, social justice, mission of the legal education. So experiential learning not only outside the in the community and outside the law school, we also have several courses which explain about this experiential learning. This in the legal education all over the world, they call as a clinical legal education. Like in the medicine, in the MBBS course, they have a teaching hospitals. The medical college will not be given a permission unless you have a teaching hospital. Similarly, Professor Madhav Menon, when they started with this 1986, they said you need to have a clinical course. So they wanted to encourage, and this is an emerging world over clinical legal education. Learning the law is important, and how the learn works, how the law really works in the community, learning the law in practice. The several aspects of experiential learning are integrated into the legal education in India. Third is a research and scholarship. In fact, this is what again emphasized we have inbuilt into the curriculum from the first year onwards. The law school's 5-year integrated program mostly offer semester-wise 10 semesters. There are about 50 courses or 60 courses. In each course, student has to publish a project. As a project is about 30 marks, 70 marks is about the end semester. So this project, idea of the project is to prepare them how to write a research article. I know it is where a teacher takes a lot of interest, discuss the draft and guides the student. Then the research inputs will be much more. In fact, in the first year, we used to give several of these. First day in the court, first day in juvenile court, first day you travel in a train or a bus. So several things of thinking more, not like a desk-based research. So we used to give that several experiential learning, and then research and scholarship we encourage, and then teaching and research will go almost all both combinedly in the teaching of the law school. And once you teach, and teaching method in the law schools is more because of the case law method. We encourage more of a dialogue, and therefore teacher. In fact, some of my colleagues in the Bangalore say teaching in the national law schools is a hazardous occupation because you're bombarded with the questions. In fact, we encourage the students to ask more and more questions. At the same time, teacher needs to know how to supervise the questions which are coming up. The fourth issue I would like to briefly share about technology-enabled education. In fact, national law schools are a different animal, I said in the beginning, because they are created under a state act. Technically, there are state universities created under a state statute in several states, but the students come from all over India, and they come on the basis of either common law admission test, and also in the NLU Delhi organizes a separate test, All India Law Exam test, Law Entrance test. So we get a good student, those who come from all over India. So therefore, compared to the conventional universities, the fee structure also is slightly higher. So therefore, from the beginning onwards, and most of the students have their own laptops, so technology-enabled education is given importance from the beginning. In the initial days, we used to have a computer course also, but now all the students who come into the law schools and like other universities are also technologically very proficient, and so they know and they regularly use. In fact, sometimes in the class, we may not encourage students looking at on the computer or the laptop, but we discourage. But before a teacher starts discussion, the student knows he'll raise a question. Madam or sir, whatever you said was a case which was an outmoded case, which was repealed. That statute is repealed, the section is repealed, this is outmoded. So therefore, technology, particularly the amount of the materials which are available in the World Wide Web and of the several international legal databases, I think that makes students very easy. And then they also will try to see sometimes test the teacher also. So technology-enabled education is facilitates more and more learning. But I think what the new National Education Policy 2020 is advocating is we should develop a technology infrastructure And we have seen the UGC and MHRD has come out with the online courses, and with the NAAC grade, the universities have given complete autonomy to start online courses if they fall under the grade 1 autonomous status. So therefore, in the coming years, technology-enabled education is going to be a major lead, and that's going to be the major source of revenue for the universities. So we have to slowly transform from the old distance education and open distance method to the online method. I think Professor Santosh Panda will be the right person. Maybe he will be explaining about this. I think that is, we need to really focus. How do we develop technology-enabled education in our universities? How do we encourage the faculty to develop their own MOOCs and use the existing MOOCs in the teaching learning process? Fifth one, very important, is the NEP 2020 is advocating about National Academic Bank of Credits. I think that's a wonderful thing they are trying to develop. And this we have already started implementing in the law schools. We offer 1 credit, 2 credit courses. We request any expert in India, sometimes outside India also, we invite them to offer a 1 credit course or 2 credit course, short-term courses, and that will really add and it will enhance the learning in the law schools. I would advise the teachers and others, I think you must use this 1 credit and 2 credit course, offer 2 credit course. I think that with the additional courses, and the National Academic Bank of Credits is encouraging that any university should collaborate with other universities. We can take courses from IITs, we can take courses from other. Initially, this National Academic Bank of Credits is confined to the postgraduate courses, but the idea is to extend. The idea is to extend later to the graduate programs. But I think this is the best method we should look at. We should identify. Each university should have a committee. That committee should look at what are the courses discipline-wise we could use, what are the courses which are available in the MOOCs. IIM Bangalore has developed several courses. Earlier, they used to offer with some fees, and now IIM Bangalore is offering all these courses free of cost. I think we should reach out, and discipline-wise, we have to develop. Next issue is flexibility of masters, planning of the master's programs. I think that's where national law universities are 2 steps forward. Some of our internationalization is one of the best international MOUs we have with several universities, especially National Law University Delhi is the highest NIRF 2nd rank after the National Law School Bangalore. We have international partners all over the world. We can start. NEP will provide us opportunity for us to look at some of these dual programs, and we can design programs with the international universities and other universities which are available in India. This is the flexibility is available, and that's where internationalization can be easily used and very effectively used. Autonomy of the courses already we have discussed. We have in the 4th year, 5th year, we have about seminar courses, clinical courses. We have been seriously thinking last 2 years how to restructure the 4th and 5th year courses. Because ultimately, the student, those who join in the 5-year integrated program, our duty mandate is also make them prepared for litigation. But if you look at self-introspection, some of the courses are not preparing, not just the theoretical knowledge which is required, the practical, what we now call as a skill-oriented, and developing a skills of legal practice is very important. We are looking at, in fact, there was a lot of discussion is going on. Maybe the consortium of national law universities also is seriously discussing. I think if some of you are aware, 2019, we have established the consortium of the national law universities at the National Law School, Bangalore. One of the discussion we are having about how do we restructure, how do we make fourth and fifth year more and more litigation friendly. Several things are coming up. In fact, here I must say, if you look at the original, the establishment of the national law universities, the thinking in the 1980s, late 1970s is how do we bring a partnership between the legal profession, judiciary, and legal academia and industry. But sometimes it happened, some law schools it happened, but many things needs to be done. So NEP 2020 gives us another opportunity for us to bring them together. The legal profession should participate, judiciary should participate in the curriculum, and also help in the learning process, and particularly the law firms, the companies should come together and see how do we make this complete restructuration of the curriculum and make students, almost all the law students, practice ready. You look at the international level, international trade and investment is really emerging. International intellectual property law is emerging. Insolvency banking law, along with that, what we call as a bread butter courses, constitutional law, criminal law, labor law, several areas. I think that is what is required, is a complete litigation preparedness which is required, and that is one of the mandate of the law schools. Internationalization I have discussed. I don't want to take much time, and if we have time for the discussion, we can take up some of these issues. And the NEP, another, I would look at NEP 2020, one of the important significant aspect is to make teachers more competent and establish scholars in their own discipline. And last two more issues, and then I'll stop. The last issues are related to fundraising. In fact, Soumendra Mohan Patnaik also said, if you look at the NEP 2020 is trying like a self-reliance of the universities. The universities have to develop their own funding and infrastructure in the coming years. I think that requires fundraising. Was in the Indian universities, we have never thought about fundraising. So fundraising is another one. I think that has to be taken care in the coming years. And I would leave with a few ideas where our colleagues, we started thinking about using the NEP 2020, whichever the leverage which is available. What is required is a serious introspection into our academic planning, research planning, financial planning, information technology planning, internationalization planning, students and alumni connect. I think that's what we have not used. Universities like Ravenshaw University is the oldest university, like a Presidency College in Calcutta. Ravenshaw University is very well known. If you ask anyone, everybody says, I studied in Ravenshaw University. That's a great university. It's a huge alumni Ravenshaw University has. How do we use the alumni? Not only for the fundraising and other, but also intellectual input which is required. Intellectual engagement is required. Lastly is universities also has a public role. As Professor Patnaik was saying, how do we engage with the community? How do we develop? How do we give back our knowledge to the community? How do we develop in the prosperity, growth, and development of the Orissa? So we need to think about how the universities can engage with the community, help contribute to the public service and development of the state. These are some of the thoughts I thought I'll share with you. And I once again thank Professor Ishan Patro for giving me this opportunity to think about how the law schools should move forward and how they should understand the NEP 2020 and to strengthen the legal education in India. My teacher always used to say, what he used to say is the university is a world of engaging with ideas. You should immerse in the ideas. Every time when you come to the classroom, when you think about new ideas of teaching, new ideas of research, new ideas of contributing to the development of the university. So we should not only have a creative, innovative ideas, but we should live and immerse with the ideas. And he always used to say, teachers' main duty is first to read, teach, write, and reflect. And if all of us collectively as a team we do that, NEP 2020 is a real golden opportunity to move forward, think for the next 20 years, 2040, how all the universities in India should really transform. That requires the collective leadership between the four pillars of the university: teachers, staff, students, alumni, and engagement with the Indian universities and the universities all over the world. So with these few words, thank you for giving me this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you, Professor Rao, and thank you, Professor Patnaik, for such wonderful deliberations. I'm extremely sorry that there's some technical glitch with the connectivity of Professor Santosh Pandaji, and we will have his lecture now rescheduled for Saturday in the evening. After the first lecture, maybe that could be the first lecture at 3:30. Professor Panda will be talking about regulatory aspects of NEP 2020. Now we have come to understand in 3 days deliberations, another 3 more days to go. We understand now that this NEP 2020 is a large challenge for the leaders, in particular, the vice chancellors of universities, the principals of autonomous colleges, and the administrators like the governors and the governing bodies. The most looked out, seeked after will be the leading T. We have got a wonderful and very educated governor and honorable chancellor who initiated this activity and put us on to work to start thinking. For any other state comes up like this, there has never been a webinar of this kind where all the vice chancellors are speaking on their own understanding of NEP and the way they want it to happen. So summing up, all the vice chancellors will really definitely bring in a document which I'm pretty sure our honorable chancellor sir will like it, and the government will also appreciate having a look into that. On the last day, of course, we've got our honorable Minister for Higher Education coming to listen to the report of this deliberations going on, and there will be a small presentation also by the Vice Chairman of the Higher Education Council of Odisha. What I understand now is that we have got a lot of take-home messages from these lectures, and my colleagues, co-vice chancellors in the state, and like we had Rao Saab here, now he is of course in Delhi, but then we consider him very much here also, and we all together are definitely going to give a different tune to the Odisha institutes, higher education institutes, and possibly we will reach to a different height in the context of in the national context. I'm extremely thankful to Professor Patnaik for so lucidly bringing up the point and telling who could be a proper vice chancellor or leader of the true higher education institute. That's become a very big challenge for each one of us talking or listening to the lecture. And what we envisage now is that to continue with these chairs under the NEP 2020 vision, one ought to be really having two, three offices, an academic office, an administrative office, and then a social office, where you will be talking to your students, to the leaders, and to the administrators, and to everyone. Was very interesting in this NEP 2020. I understand is the more you read, there's only 60 pages, but every sentence can bring up a few pages. No, if you go on analyzing every sentence in this, it could go to a Ramayana, big volume of sayings, whatever is there. So what it takes us back is, it takes us back to the values of education that we had in this country, which we have forgotten by copying the other ways of doing education. So we are coming back to our own way of learning and teaching and learning. And definitely, we will love to have the technology. It belongs to human race, doesn't belong to any specific country or anything. It has come from the human brain, so it has to be used by human beings. And with all the technologies available to us, we are definitely so, by 2040, what the NEP is targeting, we will definitely be the gurus of the world. We are today, but we will establish ourselves without any doubt. And with this note, I look forward to more lectures in next 3 days, and then a concluding report that we are going to produce for the government of Orissa and for the makers of NEP 2020. I'm extremely happy that you spared your time, and for a formal vote of thanks, I'll ask Professor Mahapatra to take over. Professor Mahapatra, please.
Thank you, sir. I'm really privileged to provide a formal vote of thanks to all the speakers and all those who were here and who made this webinar successful the third day, and we have 3 other days to go. I am really thankful to Professor Soumendra Mohan Patnaik, who has spoke on the governance related issues, and it was really, if you look at the comment box, you can know how nicely the lecture was presented and how people have commented on the lecture. I am very thankful to him that he could able to spend some time with us and could able to present the lecture because we were so much interested to listen to Professor Santosh Panda, but unfortunately technical issues were there and we could not able to listen to the lecture, and we are hopeful that this nice lecture, we are waiting for it on day after tomorrow in the 5th day of the webinar. I thank Professor Patnaik for his presentation. I also thank Professor Panda for all along staying with us in the seminar, in the webinar. I also thank Professor Krishnadeva Rao, one old friend of Ravensa and a regular visitor to Ravensa, and he could also able to accept our invitation. I thank Professor Patra, our Vice Chancellor, who was actually the main driving force behind this webinar series. It is his idea and his encouragement and leadership which activated all of us. And it is not the only webinar that Ravensa has organized. Ravensa has organized many such webinars during last 4 or 5 months during the lockdown periods, and the campus has remained active, rather on wave, though not in the classroom. And every time the Vice Chancellor used to be present in all the webinars, and his leadership has made it possible for us to maintain the academic activity inside the campus. I thank Professor Gauranga Nanda, the former professor of education in the Ravensa University, for his active participation, coordination, planning, and monitoring of this webinar. I also thank Dr. Ranjana Bajpai and Dr. Urmisi Vedmata, who are there in the seminar, in the webinar throughout the series, and they have acted as the main organizers. I thank Dr. Sudarshan Mishra, the head of the Department of Education and head of the team, and all his members, all members of the Department of Education, for working to make this webinar successful. My special thanks to Dr. Arvind Bobby Vinja and Dr. Mrs. Silpa Sahu for the technical planning and support. I thank all those who are behind the scene to make this webinar successful. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, sir.